So why did I start studying shift signals? Because I woke up every morning and I just felt bombarded with a lot of things coming at me. And I thought, how do I compartmentalize those things and how do I make sense of them? So through my studies at City University, I thought I've got to study this because there's got to be a better way to organize this and to look at the future as to what signals are coming at us and then how do we make sense of those signals. So survey says, first of all, we're going to talk about 4 different areas. Shift tectonics. And I really like that word tectonics because I learned it way back in geology, and I really felt that that's what was happening today to our industry. Next, we're going to talk about country shift, talk about business models, and then a framework for how we can look at this shift to help it from mitigation standpoint. So as we look at our trends today, we have to be able to read our future. So today, the top 3 shifts that you identified were number 1, shift of sourcing countries to low-cost country sourcing. Okay, so that just continues to be what I call the sourcing caravan. We haven't changed. We keep trying to find new places to go to, new places to source. It also raises a lot more risks because where we've maybe mitigated risks in one market and we have a stable supply chain, now we head off. So it's like packing up all your goods and moving off to a new neighborhood and trying to meet the neighbors and trying to figure out, how to survive in that market. The second all was shifts in tariffs and preferential trade agreements. So I won't say the T word, like the White House word, but I'll say the trade agreements. And we have to learn how to survive in a world that, hey, there's been so much investment from a U.S. standpoint of looking at Vietnam, and then all of a sudden TPP went away. It was devastating, actually, when you started to look at what were some alternatives to China. And the third top shift was a shift of business models. So as we look at those 3 shifts, then we break them down into traditional versus emerging. So, really felt that we had to understand what have we been accustomed to for a long time, traditional, and then what's coming at us that's classified as emerging. And if we look at the top 4 of these trends for the traditional, number 1, traditional, shift of sourcing countries. Number 2, shift in tariffs and preferred trade agreements. Number 3 was shift in manual Excel spreadsheets into supply chain tracking. So software companies, you'll be very glad to hear that. We still have Excel spreadsheets. Don't take my sheet away from me, but we're still trying to, get more in depth as to the change management of what it takes to roll out different software programs. And the 4th traditional was really shift in speed. So while we've known speed's important, I think speed just continues to evolve into new different business models. And then how do we affect that? So if we look at the 4 top emerging shifts, the first one is the shift in emerging technologies. So going into blockchain, going into 3D printing, all of that aspect of it. The second is the shift in business models. So again, it's not just producing a product in a country and shipping it to one country. It's shipping it around the world and many other aspects of business models. The third emerging was shift of supply chain types. So from a fulfillment supply chain, which has been the focus probably for a long, long time, to now more the development supply chain. And a couple of the MIT professors are really studying this and what this impact is. So all software companies, when I think back, I'll say 20 years in my career, who were the first software companies to call and what did they offer to me? It was really offering more of that back-end supply chain, more of that from maybe sourcing or order acceptance to confirmed on board. And then the 4th emerging was the shift of power from buyer-centric to consumer-centric. And, that really, I don't know if we know the true impact of that. I think it really changes everything. So if we really know who our customer is, then as you start to look at some of these shifts, then maybe things fall into place a little bit better. So then from traditional to emerging, I wanted to look at the timing or the impact of these shifts. So the 4 traditional ones, they stayed as an immediate impact of time, which was kind of interesting, I thought. But traditional, okay, we're used to it, so we're probably thinking it's more immediate. I know I have to deal with it every day. But as we look at the emerging here in the blue is 1 to 3 years. So those were these 4 along the bottom, these 4 center blue ones. So shift of business models, shift of the power to the consumer, shift of manual labor to automated labor in factories, and shift of supply chain types. And then the 4 to 6 years emerging shifts were the emerging technologies, and then the shift in raw materials. So then, getting now one depth lower, then how do we mitigate some of these? So when I looked at the traditional 4 that were identified, those 4 shifts, 3 out of the 4 we felt were controllable. So kind of 3 different areas: controllable, influenceable, I think that's a word. It sounds like influenza, but influenceable. and then the last one is uncontrollable, all right? So 3 out of the 4 were controllable, but there was one traditional shift that was uncontrollable: trade regulation, the preferred trade agreements, tariffs. For emerging, the 1 to 3 years impact, 3 out of those 4 were influenceable. And there was one emerging that was considered controllable, which was the shift in supply chain types. So you can look at, what supply chain you're going to plan out. And then in the emerging category, we had 2, and both of those shifts were deemed as influenceable. So what does this bring us to? So it's the New World Disorder. And as you can see from this graphic, geopolitical unrest, service provider upheaval, companies acquiring companies, business model disruption, a company M&A, that immediately changes the past company's business model. Talent models, how do we attract that talent and keep them? How do we attract millennials and keep them? How do we keep the employees that have been with us for a long time, that have that strong knowledge of our business? And then, of course, the technology disruption. So that leads us into then our number 1 top trend, which is global sourcing country shift, so our sourcing caravan. So a couple of the questions. So new sourcing countries that your company engaged in the past 2 years. The first one was, the highest one was Ethiopia. Second was Myanmar. Okay, now I have to preface this because I did do demographics in this survey, and probably about 40% were European that answered, 60% were from the US. But I think Myanmar was answered the most. There were about 5 or 6 companies or so that answered from the US. So it's a very interesting market, but with a lot of challenges. Bangladesh, 20%, Cambodia, 14%, and India also at 14%. So as I asked the question about the historical sourcing caravan, do you all still agree with this? Yes. So almost over 80% still agree that this continues to be our sourcing pattern. But now let's break it down into a little bit of nearshoring and reshoring. So in the nearshoring, do you agree that this is going to become an important strategy in the next 2 years? Yes, 60% agreed that it was. Now, if you get more specific then on reshoring, which I'm defining as bringing manufacturing back to your headquarters country, 45% said we're not there yet. There were about 10% that said, we're going to get to maybe 1%, and then about 20% that said both 1 to 5% in the next 2 years, and then 5 to 10% that also said 20%. So, but with that has to come automation. So there are companies I know of in the US that are working on this automation. They have gotten to the point of more what I'll call the personalization, maybe 1 to 5 to 10, but it's not a mass production yet. So that continues to be following this reshoring aspect. But the nearshoring strategy is probably a little bit more apropos right now. And I really tried to break it into maybe more U.S. focused, which would be Central America, or European focused, which would be Eastern Europe or Northern Africa. So both answered very high percentage for little or no change yet in moving to those areas. About 40% or so said that yes, Central America and the U.S. Headquartered market would become more important. There's recently been a lot of investment in Honduras with new spinning capabilities, as well as some additional investment in El Salvador. But where for U.S. companies, we also used to produce in Nicaragua, a lot of political stuff going on right now in Nicaragua. So Eastern Europe and Northern Africa, about 48 to 50% said no change, but about 29 to, so about 40% said yes. Between 1 and 10% in the next several years, there will be an increase. So as we look at that, then what was your highest ranking for the most important? For Central America, it was the trade agreements. So if you're shipping into the U.S., we can use Central America Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, which brings in your garments duty-free. Next, for EU-based, the first priority was close proximity to the selling market, as well as a less transit time. And then as we heard our speaker on Lorenzo on Africa sourcing, so 60% said still not there yet, but there's a strong 28% that said yes, in the next 1 to 6% would be the percent increase that they would take their sourcing into Africa. So as we break this down and really look at since 1993 in the U.S., so looked at almost every 10 years, the last were 5 years. So we can see the growth of China from 1993 to the present. However, the last from 2012 to 2017, it started to decrease, so about 4, almost 5%. Vietnam continues to be very strong. However, you see in 1993, it was 0%. And that's because the U.S. at that time did not have normalized trade relations with Vietnam. So that started in 1995. I think there was some data that started in 94. But as you can see, 59% change in that market. Well, as well as India, Bangladesh growing, but a little bit of decreases in Indonesia. I think Pakistan has grown a lot the last couple years. Honduras, Cambodia were other ones that were slight decreases. And I haven't forgotten my European friends. So as we look at the EU 28, from 2015 to 2017, we see China, very strong still, but obviously decreasing. Bangladesh is increasing. Turkey, India, and Cambodia staying just about the same. Now, I understand that the EU is looking at a EU-Vietnam free trade agreement, so that's up and coming, which could influence a lot of the production going into Vietnam, as well as they're looking at the EU-Cambodia agreement for specific human rights. So if that's taken away and Vietnam is signed, there'll be a lot of transfer right across the border there. So many of you are much more experts than I am in the EU. Okay, so next we move to looking at the organizational level. So global sourcing traditionally has had what I'll say 5 levels. So you start out maybe as a domestic company, you buy from domestic suppliers. Next you go into, I'll start buying from suppliers that are buying overseas. And then next you get into maybe some international purchasing, maybe you start to set up an office. Level 4 and 5, you start to engage throughout your company and then start engaging with suppliers. So those are the traditional, if you look at companies all along the way, that has been the pattern. And I call that more the linear economy, because it's really started from, I'm going to think of a design. Okay, now I found my fabric. Now I'm going to make it. Now I'm going to sell it. And then eventually, there's no disposable except for in people's closets like mine that are full of apparel. So, but next, as we started looking at digitalization, what do those emerging sourcing levels look like? It changes global sourcing tremendously. So first, level 6 of what was identified, and these were identified through a Harvard study. So the first one is really digitization. So can I find my data? Can I gather all my data and start looking at the data? Level 7 is really diving into that data and looking at big data, predictive analytics. Level 8 is going to a platform economy. Okay, if you're a global sourcing department in that, you have other companies that you're working with. Maybe that other company is stronger in sourcing in Africa than maybe you've never sourced there. So that changes your global sourcing. Level 9 is circular economy. Okay, circular economy goes back to that designer, and if I'm designing something, I have to think about how I dispose of it. So design, dispose, I mean, that's never been a language in universities in teaching students about design. So, but obviously today with sustainability it is. And level 10, I don't know, maybe this is really as more rockets are shot to the moon and Mars, and we have automation, maybe that's where that's taking place. So that was a little far out there, but needed that type of thing. So the levels, you see these percentages across here, those were the percentages that if I gave you all 10 levels, that's where you said your company was at. So you'll see here, level 4 and 5, 23%, level 5, 9%, and then you kind of moving into level 6 and 7, 15 and 11%, and then 7% said circular economy. Okay, so what was that shift when we look at, and you're given now with these emerging digital economy, what took place? So the first level, not much change, 2%. Second level, 1.4. Third, 1.4. But look at this shift. 15% of those companies who answered level 4 moved out. Level 5, another 10% of those companies moved out. So I go back to this chart, and you can see where that move has been into level 6 and level 7. So people trying, as we engage with new software programs, gathering that data, gathering it from your ocean carriers, gathering it from your suppliers, having web portals that your vendor can put in information instead of gathering all these Excel spreadsheets. So, and then in level 7 now, really starting to look at the data that you have and predictive analytics. So I just wanted to highlight, again, this circular economy that as we talk about sustainability, that is really changing things. So I have to know the raw materials that go into my product. So I can't guess on that raw material and then say it's sustainable. So, you know, what Karen presented and having that traceability, that becomes more important. But whose responsibility is it in the organization to do that? Is that the designer? I mean, the designer's like, I want to sketch, I want to create. Do you have to have people that then help in your raw materials? And then those are the ones that help the designers as they're designing. And then ultimately, how will I dispose of it? So as you can see, throughout the organization, this creates a lot of conflict. So if you have production people that are just trying to get things out the door and make it, wait a minute, I've got to go back because I've got to get this yarn, so I can't start my production yet in the factory. How do we look at these things, and how do we create a framework that we can forecast and mitigate these shifts? So I asked 3 different questions here. The first one was, does your company use any framework for identifying and forecasting long-term emerging trends and sourcing business models today? 60% said no. 40% said yes. Okay? And then when you got into more of a formal risk assessment, most people answered yeah, they agreed that we do have a formal risk assessment. And then is there a risk assessment of how these shifts are affecting just global sourcing? About 66% agreed. So, but I feel there's a gap between identifying or forecasting these long-term emerging trends and how do you do it? As we try to look outside of our industry and see what's being done where, and maybe even into the technology area, how are they forecasting some of these new technologies? So here's a forecasting methodology that is kind of a funnel, a 6-step funnel. So you go out there and you look at the fringe, what's happening, gathering all those news articles, and then kind of put it through a cipher. So what are hidden patterns? How do you categorize each of those? So if you have all your news articles, maybe you've got a lot of stacks, you're throwing them out in, or technology, a much better way to do it. But then asking the right questions. And then getting into calculating the ETA. So that's what I tried to do in the survey was, as we look at the shifts, what is that ETA that's out there? And that may be our ETA today. If we take the survey a year from now, it could be entirely different. Maybe raw materials, the level of that has grown so much, and now it's easy to find yarns and fibers that are sustainable. And then take those and write out your strategy. So what is your company's strategy? And then how does it relate to the type of supply chain that you have to implement to make it happen? And then pressure test it. Do some pilot testing of each of these so that you can come up with your answers. So in this foresight methodology, there's a lot of different charts. And I just chose one to share with you today for time's sake. But they're looking at the uncertainty of technology in the market today. So you can see here the lows and the highs. Number one, can you do it? And number two, does the market want it? So then it goes back to that customer. What does my customer want? So you've got to go through a learning stage and then developing the ideas, capability building. Can we do it? And then continue to listening for the signals out there and watching the horizon. So as I thought through this, I thought, how many suppliers come to me to do a survey? Probably not too many. I mean, we talk, what's your plans for the next 2 to 3 years? But it comes back to that collaboration and that trust in working with the supplier so that you can share ideas and share, if you get to a platform economy, that's a different aspect to sharing resources. But really sharing the resources of what's out there and helping to educate as we continue to go forward with all these shifts. So thank you very much. That's what I wanted to share with you today, and thank you, Jane. I appreciate your time.